Thank you. Don, how do we, now that we have a budget, how do we can convert that budget into a realistic design that we can afford to build?
I get to have all the fun in the building programs because I get to draw and design the buildings and watch them go up. Next slide, please, Pastor Eddie. This is typical of what an architect would do for you once he understands what your vision is for your ministry. However, over the last 10, 15 years and hundreds of churches, I've never once had a church whose aspirations and needs did not greatly exceed their budget capabilities. So you're in good shape because we've never had a situation where a church had enough money to do what they wanted to do. The important thing is to develop a roadmap, a plan, a long-range plan that can be implemented over a period of time that will ultimately meet your vision. And this is typical of a campus plan for a church. And this church plan includes everything from some of these reoccurring revenue stream options, like senior housing, like some mixed use, some commercial retail, charter schools, elementary school, high school. It contains a little bit of everything, including housing. You know, there are churches that are beginning to realize that just providing housing and workforce housing, they can do a lot in terms of expanding their ministry.
But Don, when I look at this, I said, my plan was to build a sanctuary. You got a lot of stuff going on up there. How do I get to that point, and why am I considering all of that right now when I only want a sanctuary?
Great. Next slide, please, Eddie. And here's how you do it. You got to come up with a phased plan. This is a case study, and I'll quickly go through these, where this particular church had to implement a multi-phase program. Keep hitting the button if you would. And so they came up with a three-step, or we came up with a three-step program that would grow them into their space. Next slide, please. This is a perfect example of Tim answering your question. This is a church that had a great vision and very limited resources. We still developed a master plan for them. This is a regional church. I have about a 4,000 seat sanctuary when they're finished. But we designed an interim building right here. And next slide, please, Eddie. This gave them their first step to that roadmap. It allowed them to get into a facility that met their budget requirements and limitations so they could get on their property and begin to grow their ministry. To fund the balance of their campus, this church now is looking at other alternatives. But when we do the first phase, you still don't want to sacrifice or compromise the worship space, because it is going to be a worship space and you're going to use it for a period of time. So this is what you can ultimately do. And next slide, please, Eddie. Never want to compromise any particular phase of your project. You always want to build a fun worship space. You also want to make sure that you meet the needs of your community, whether it's youth or seniors. Next slide, please. All of this was in an interim, their first phase of a project. Again, keep on going, please. The second phase, which we're doing right now for them, is their senior housing project, which is going to be able to not only expand their senior ministry, but to generate a significant reoccurring stream of revenue that will allow them to either pay off their existing debt or fund additional ministries. Next slide. And that's just kind of a plan of what it's going to look like. The tremendous need, as Dan had mentioned, and as Gary had mentioned, to serve the needs of our seniors. This church is stepping out, and they're going to be able to have a much greater impact on the community and grow their ministry. And this is what it's going to look like. Now, this is another case study, because I want to go into one other type of recurring revenue stream option. This was a church that, again, their ministry needs outpaced their budget capabilities. So we went in and looked at the opportunity to have a charter school and a preschool. Next slide, please. They could not afford to build their entire first phase, so we were able to break that up into smaller bits and pieces so they could still meet their budget limitations. Next slide, please. So their first phase consisted of a focus on the youth and children so they could leverage that space to create preschool that would be open to the community and to create a charter school so they could actually, in this case, use state funding to actually pay the debt service on their church campus. Next slide, please. All along, still focusing on ministry as our goal and creating the types of spaces that draw the community. This particular church went from a weekly attendance of 1,200 to a weekly attendance of over 5,000 in 4 months. And it was because they understood what they needed to do to bring the community in. Now the community is coming from long distances because of those ministry opportunities they are providing.
Now, I got a better understanding of master plan and why I'm planning for something more than I need right now. But how do I go about finding an architect? How, there's architects that design retail centers, there's architects who design schools, but how do I specifically find an architect for my need that would design the type of church that I need?
Great question. Because you will either be successful with the architect you select, or you will not be successful and you will fail. You have to find experience. You have to find a Christian attitude from that architect, someone that understands what your ministry means, what ministry and what God is doing in his believers. So you really have to find someone that's going to be able to combine those things and have the experience. You don't want someone that has done a church once in a while. Believe me, the more you do, the better you get at it. So you need to seek out someone that can bring those experiences from dozens and hundreds of other churches and show you what other people are doing and what has been successful and what hasn't been successful.
Now, on that same note, I have an architect. I also want to select a contractor. I'm sure many pastors are faced with in their congregation. There are a number of contractors in their congregation. Everybody wants to build a church. Everybody is trying to position themselves to build a church, but they may not have that experience in building a church. Frank or Dean, do you guys have any experience in what you should be looking for when you're trying to select a contractor?
I think in a church considering a contractor, you may want to sit and think about this entire process that we're talking about. Some of the mistakes that are made tend to be stumbling blocks throughout the process. You want someone with experience. My firm has built 44 churches as a case in point. And trust me, we deal sometimes with a pastor, sometimes we deal with a building committee, or sometimes I don't know if this is in your church, but there's a power broker in that church and things need to be done his way. And we have to learn how to negotiate the project. In getting ourselves qualified, you need to look at who's helped you with programming and who's helped you with the architecture of that project. It is our job early on, based on our church building experience, to tell you what the price will be. Frank mentioned earlier that we can do that very quickly based on the database information that we have. We know what a square foot of church based on its finishes, its height of ceiling. We know what those costs are. And before you start all of this process, we need to have early involvement in the process.
So what do you want to come in at? We talked about selecting an architect, and then we talked about a contractor. At what point should architect, contractor come together?
When Don Lawson comes up with a concept that you like, at some point during that, we need to tell you, taking all of the issues in hand, and it's not just the vertical construction of that building. It is what kind of traffic impact are you going to have on the road out front? Are there water issues? Is there a drainage issue? Is there a utility supply issue? And you have to look at all those factors and